We will listen to the whispers of paper and parchment, feel the weight of stone, tablets against our palms, and glimpse shadows of knowledge both preserved and lost. If this nighttime journey through the dreaming archives touches your thoughts, consider joining us again to explore other forgotten corridors of time, and perhaps share where you find yourself listening from. Now, dim your lights, settle into comfort, and breathe deeply. We're about to cross the threshold where the archive of human memory dreams alongside us. The last researcher departed hours ago. Keys turned in locks, lights switched off one by one, the final footsteps echoing down marble corridors until only silence remained. But the archive is never truly silent. I know this because I stay behind each night, a witness to what happens when the documents believe themselves unobserved. The quiet that follows human departure is merely prelude, a drawing of breath before the paper memories begin to whisper. I sit motionless in shadow as the transformation begins. First comes the settling, the subtle creaking of shelves adjusting, their burdens, the almost imperceptible shifting of volumes finding more comfortable positions after a day of handling. Temperature changes as night deepens, causing materials to contract or expand by microscopic measures. Conservators know this phenomenon well. They monitor environmental conditions with digital precision. What they don't record in their meticulous logs is how these physical changes release something less tangible: the accumulated weight of words, thoughts, and stories preserved within. The first whispers always begin near the oldest collections. Tonight they emerge from a cabinet of letters dating to the American Civil War. A soldier's correspondence with his wife, their paper now amber with age. Exchanges softly spoken memories of apple orchards and promises of return. In the measured handwriting of the 19th century, love and fear intertwine like vines climbing the same trellis. During daylight hours, these letters are merely historical documents, categorized by date and biographical relevance. But after midnight, they remember being clutched by trembling hands, tear-stained, read repeatedly until their words were memorized by hearts now long stilled. All archives are haunted, wrote the French historian Jules Michelet in 1869, not by specters in the conventional sense, but by the accumulated emotion impressed upon materials that have witnessed human drama. This observation came after he spent 3 years working alone in the National Archives of France, often staying until dawn. Colleagues attributed his increasingly poetic historical writings to exhaustion or romantic temperament, never suspecting he was simply transcribing what the documents shared during their nighttime conversations. A curious phenomenon occurs in large archival collections that remained unexplained until the early 21st century. Certain areas develop what conservation specialists term microclimate anomalies, spaces where temperature and humidity readings diverge from surrounding areas despite no apparent physical cause. These pockets often correspond to collections with particularly emotional content, war testimonies, trial records of the unjustly accused, love letters never sent. Some archivists privately theorize these fluctuations represent emotional energy preserved alongside intellectual content, though such notions remain firmly outside official conservation literature. The whispers grow more numerous as midnight approaches. From the map room, unfurled atlases murmur of coastlines that have changed, borders that have shifted, and cities that have disappeared beneath waves or warfare. Medieval manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf catch non-existent moonlight, their jewel-toned pigments glowing with subtle luminescence, as if remembering the candlelit scriptoria where monks bent over their creation. A collection of theater playbills recalls applause long faded, while passenger manifests from immigrant ships recite names of those who crossed oceans seeking new beginnings. I move silently between the stacks, a curator of night voices. My footsteps make no sound, perhaps because I am merely another memory the archive has absorbed, another presence folded into its vast collection of human experience. Near the preservation room, I pause as photographic negatives engage in conversation with daguerreotypes about the changing nature of light captured and held. They speak in silver tones, these early images, lamenting how digital archives, for all their accessibility, will never know the alchemical pleasure of light transforming silver halide into memory. The most poignant whispers often come from the incomplete collections. Fragments of journals with missing pages, correspondence sequences with gaps where letters were lost, partial manuscripts whose conclusions vanished centuries ago. These broken narratives reach toward completion in their dreams, spinning possible continuations into the darkness. Do our own incomplete stories and unfinished conversations similarly seek resolution when we sleep? Perhaps the human mind and the archive share this quality, this need to weave wholeness from fragments, to resist the untidy severance of narrative threads. Near the restricted access section, a collection of ancient papyri converses in languages no living tongue can pronounce. Their whispers carry the rhythms of forgotten grammar, the music of extinct syntax. Linguists spend careers reconstructing these lost languages, but after midnight, the papyri remember being spoken. They recall marketplaces filled with voices, poetry recited under desert stars, declarations of love and declarations of war, all in sounds academic reconstruction can only approximate. As the night deepens toward its middle hours, the whispers blend into a continuous murmur, a river of human experience flowing through centuries. I stand at its banks, listening to the current of collected memory. The archive holds more than information. It cradles the tangible remains of human consciousness. Each document represents not merely the words or images it contains, but the minds that created it, the hands that formed its letters, the eyes that once read its message, the hearts moved by its contents. The true archive exists in the space between documents, wrote the archivist Maria Rodriguez in her controversial 2012 paper that was quietly removed from most academic journals. What we preserve is merely the skeleton, the living tissue, context, emotion, intention, must be imagined back into existence with each reading. Her theory that archives should be understood as dreamscapes rather than repositories cost her academic standing, but earned her a devoted following among certain poetically inclined information scientists. The digital archives join the conversation. As the night progresses, their whispers taking electronic form. Subtle fluctuations in server rooms, microscopic movements of magnetic storage. They speak more rapidly than their physical counterparts, their memories compressed and indexed, but they speak nonetheless. They wonder about permanence, these younger collections, asking their paper ancestors how to survive centuries when their own expected lifespan might be measured in decades before migration to new formats becomes necessary. Dawn approaches too soon, as it always does. The whispers begin to fade, documents settling back into their daylight silence. I remain to witness this transition, this daily forgetting. Soon researchers will return, handling these materials with white-gloved reverence or casual academic interest, never suspecting that between their scholarly investigations, the archive continues its own research into the nature of memory and time. What dreams might fill our own collected memories if consciousness persists beyond its physical vessel? Do our gathered thoughts whisper to each other when we no longer articulate them ourselves? The climate-controlled room housing the museum's Mesopotamian collection maintains a constant temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a compromise between conservation requirements and human comfort. Yet the clay tablets dream of much warmer air, of baking sun and river breezes that once dried the impressions pressed into their surfaces over 4,000 years ago. I move between the sealed display cases, listening as the ancient cuneiform remembers the waters that gave birth to human writing. Unlike paper with its whispered confidences, clay speaks in a deeper register, a voice that seems to rise from the earth itself. These tablets, some no larger than the palm of my hand, carry the first systematic writing humans ever devised. Their wedge-shaped impressions record transactions, royal decrees, astronomical observations, and epic poetry from civilizations clustered along rivers that still flow but no longer nurture the same cultures. Each tablet holds not just the words pressed into its surface, but the memory of the waters that made its creation possible. The Tigris ran high that season, murmurs a Neo-Assyrian administrative record, its surface crowded with neat columns, of cuneiform. The scribes worried about flooding in the tablet storage rooms. This practical concern, never explicitly written in the inventory of grain distributions the tablet officially records, surfaces now as the clay remembers its own creation context. Archaeological reports note that many ancient archives show evidence of having been moved to higher shelves or upper floors during certain seasons. Physical adjustments to accommodate the river's rhythms that governed life in ancient Mesopotamia. The relationship between writing and water runs deeper than practical considerations of flood prevention. The earliest cuneiform emerged in Uruk around 3400 BCE, developed primarily to record agricultural production and trade, activities made possible by the irrigation systems that transformed unpredictable rivers into reliable sources of fertility. In a very real sense, writing and water management evolved as twin technologies, each making the other more essential. The tablets remember this symbiotic birth, how their purpose and the river's channeling developed in conversation with each other. A small tablet from Ur, dating to approximately 2100 BCE, holds what appears to be a student exercise. Columns of repeated signs, some awkwardly formed by inexperienced hands. After midnight, this humble object recalls the young apprentice scribe who shaped its characters, sitting in an open courtyard near the river, distracted by the sound of boats and the calls of waterbirds. The tablet remembers how the boy's teacher struck his hand when his attention wandered from the lesson, how the rippling water seemed more alive than the dead signs he struggled to master. Yet by the time he reached adulthood, those same signs had become extensions of his thought, as fluid and natural as the river itself. Few scholars acknowledge the sensory experience embedded in these ancient writing practices. In 2017, experimental archaeologist Eleanor Robson conducted a controversial study recreating ancient Mesopotamian scribal conditions, having participants sit cross-legged on reed mats for hours while copying texts in replica scribal schools. Participants reported profound physical memories of the experience months later, suggesting that bodily postures create distinctive cognitive states. The tablets remember these postures too, how the human body arranged itself around the act of impression-making, creating a physical choreography that remained largely unchanged for 3,000 years. The Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's oldest recorded story, survives on clay tablets that whisper their lines into the climate-controlled darkness. "I will tell of the man who knew all things and walked the lands," begins the standard version from Nineveh. Though after midnight, the tablets often recite older variations, fragments lost to damage, or lines that were edited away by ancient redactors. They remember being read aloud under starlight, how the tale of the flood resonated differently when told beside a river capable of both nurturing and destroying civilization. The tablets recall how listeners would glance anxiously at the water level when hearing how the gods had once decided to cleanse the earth with an inundation that only one man survived. An unusual feature of cuneiform writing rarely discussed outside specialist circles is how it preserves the physical pressure of the hand that created it. Unlike ink on paper, which sits on the surface, each wedge-shaped impression physically displaces the clay, creating a micro-topography of human intention. Assyriologists can often identify individual scribes not just by their handwriting style, but by the characteristic pressure and angle of their stylus strokes. After 3 millennia, these tablets still carry the physical imprint of specific human hands, an intimacy of connection that digital preservation, for all its advantages, cannot replicate. The tablets speak of rivers in 2 voices simultaneously, the official voice of their inscribed content, irrigation records, flood predictions, mythological references to divine rivers, and the unofficial voice of their physical memory. Many still carry trace elements of the specific riverbank clay from which they were formed. Molecular connections to waterways that continue to flow while civilizations rise and fall around them. Some even retain microscopic impressions of raindrops that fell while they were drying, or tiny fossilized remains of river organisms embedded in their matrix. Unintended records preserved alongside intentional communication. "We were temporary even as we were made to last," murmurs a royal inscription. From the reign of Hammurabi, its carefully formed signs proclaiming the king's eternal achievements. The irony is not lost on the tablet. How it has outlived the empire it was meant to glorify. How its boasts of permanence have themselves become artifacts of impermanence. Yet something of the river's lesson has been absorbed into the clays. Understanding, continuity amid change, persistence through transformation. The Euphrates that flows through modern Iraq is not the same water that flowed past ancient Babylon, yet it is the same river. Just as the cuneiform preserves thoughts that continue to speak long after their thinkers have been forgotten. Near dawn, as the tablets settle back into their daylight silence, I notice how their whispers change character. The river memories grow more prominent as sleep approaches. Perhaps because water and dreams share this quality of fluid transformation, of boundaries crossed and dissolved. The ancient Mesopotamians themselves recognized this connection, with dream interpretation texts preserved on clay tablets that describe rivers as pathways between worlds. To dream of crossing a river meant a significant life transition. To dream of clear flowing water foretold good fortune. What continuities flow through our own consciousness, I wonder, connecting our brief moment of awareness to both past and future? What impressions are we leaving that might someday speak when we no longer can? The tablets have no definitive answer, only the patient wisdom of objects that have watched civilizations rise and fall, while the rivers continue their journey to the sea. The Mediterranean night carries salt and ancient secrets on its breeze. I stand before emptiness, a space where one of humanity's greatest collections of knowledge once stood. No physical remnants mark the Library of Alexandria's location with certainty. Archaeological debates continue about its precise placement in the ancient city, yet absence has its own presence. In this vacuum, lost knowledge dreams most vividly, and the ghost of Alexandria's library wanders through the collective memory of every archive that has existed since. Smoke rises from the empty air. Phantom, recollections of flame. No one knows exactly when or how many times the library burned. Historical accounts conflict, attributing destruction variously to Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE, Emperor Aurelian's campaign in the 270s CE, or the Arab conquest of 640 CE. Perhaps all contributed to its gradual diminishment. The most dramatic narratives of a single catastrophic conflagration may be more myth than reality, yet the image persists. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls consumed by flames. Knowledge turned to ash, smoke carrying the words of ancients skyward, beyond human reach. We still burn in the imagination, whispers a text that no longer exists physically. The idea of us aflame does more work than our actual contents ever could. This paradoxical truth haunts bibliophiles and scholars, that the Library of Alexandria's greatest cultural impact may come from its destruction rather than its existence. The lost library has become a symbol more powerful than perhaps the original institution itself ever was, representing all human knowledge that slips from our grasp, all understanding just beyond reach. The ghost of the library manifests not as a single entity, but as countless partial apparitions, fragments of works known only through quotations in surviving texts, titles mentioned, but contents vanished, authors' names preserved while their words have disappeared. Aristotle's second book of Poetics on comedy, known to have existed but completely lost. Hundreds of plays by Sophocles and Euripides vanished except for tantalizing fragments. Historical accounts that might have transformed our understanding of antiquity, mathematical treatises that could have accelerated human progress, all reduced to whispers and references in surviving works. An unusual phenomenon occurs in certain archives housing ancient materials. Researchers occasionally report smelling smoke where no fire exists. This olfactory hallucination, documented but unexplained, seems to occur most frequently among classical scholars working with fragmentary texts. In a 2019 survey conducted discreetly among classics departments worldwide, 37% of respondents admitted experiencing this phantom smell at least once during intensive research sessions. Some conservation scientists attribute it to chemical compounds released by aging papyrus and parchment, but others wonder if something more mysterious occurs when modern minds commune intensely with ancient fragments, a sensory manifestation of absence itself. "We were never truly destroyed," insists a voice from the emptiness. "We were dispersed, transformed, absorbed." Historical evidence suggests that while Alexandria's library suffered significant losses over centuries, many texts survived through copies distributed throughout the ancient world. The library's ghost reminds us that knowledge rarely disappears completely. It changes form, surfaces in unexpected places, lives on through influence and reference. The recent discovery of previously unknown texts beneath the writing in recycled, medieval manuscripts, palimpsests revealing ancient works thought lost forever, confirms this stubborn persistence of written thought. The ghost wanders not just through physical archives, but through the digital spaces where human knowledge now accumulates. It hovers over the gaps in online databases, haunts the broken links and corrupted files that create digital lacunae in our modern Alexandria. It whispers warnings to server farm technicians and database administrators, cautionary tales about vulnerability and hubris. The Library of Alexandria believed in its own permanence too, collected with imperial confidence, never imagining future centuries would know it primarily as an emblem of cultural catastrophe. In the hours before dawn, when archive dreams are most vivid, I sometimes glimpse shadows of what might have been. Sappho's complete poetic works, rather than the fragments we treasure. Medical knowledge that took centuries to rediscover. Astronomical observations that might have transformed our cosmic understanding generations earlier. These phantoms of potential knowledge move between existing texts, connecting preserved islands of understanding that remain separated by seas of loss. The spaces between surviving knowledge matter as much as what remains, murmurs the library's ghost. This insight informed the work of Eratosthenes, the third librarian of Alexandria, who calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy using the library's resources. Today's scholars similarly work between fragments, inferring connections, reconstructing contexts, imagining relationships that might have been explicitly documented in texts now vanished. The ghost takes peculiar satisfaction in watching this. Intellectual detective work, human minds rebuilding pathways through the ruins. Occasionally, the lost returns. In 1906, archaeologists discovered the Oxyrhynchus papyri in an ancient Egyptian garbage dump. Thousands of fragments, including lost works by Sophocles, Euripides, and early Christian writings. In 2016, multispectral imaging revealed Archimedes' previously unknown mathematical theories in a palimpsest where his work had been overwritten with prayers. Each recovery sends ripples of excitement through both physical and phantom archives. Possibility made manifest, absence transformed back into presence. The Library of Alexandria's ghost finds particular affinity with digital preservation efforts. The Internet Archive, with its mission to store all human knowledge, the digital backups of endangered manuscripts from Timbuktu, the massive scanning projects of national libraries worldwide. Yet it whispers cautions even as it approves. Digital preservation creates its own vulnerabilities, format obsolescence, media degradation, the constant need for migration to new storage systems. Alexandria's ghost has witnessed how quickly human institutions can fail, how easily continuity can be broken. As dawn approaches, the Phantom Library grows more transparent, its whispers fainter. It leaves behind a lingering question. What knowledge are we losing now in our moment of unprecedented information creation and storage? What understandings slip between our fingers even as we believe ourselves to be capturing everything? The ghost of Alexandria suggests that loss is inevitable, not something to fear but to acknowledge as part of knowledge's life cycle. Seeds scattered from burning scrolls flowered elsewhere. Fragments preserved inspired new creation. The empty space where Alexandria's library stood fills with morning light. Not emptiness after all, but potential. The greatest legacy of the lost library may be the awareness it created of knowledge's fragility and preciousness, inspiring each subsequent generation of archivists, librarians, and digital preservationists to improve upon preservation while accepting that perfect permanence remains beyond reach. Some things must be lost for others to be found. Some destruction clears space for new growth. Even in dreams, the archive understands this paradox. The monastic library's climate-controlled rare manuscript room stands silent and dark, a technological oasis protecting medieval treasures from environmental fluctuations that threaten their survival. Yet technology cannot contain magic entirely. As midnight approaches, a subtle transformation occurs. The gold leaf adorning illuminated manuscripts begins to emit a gentle radiance, visible only to those who know how to look properly. Not with the analytical gaze of scholarly examination, but with peripheral vision that catches what lies between observation and imagination. I move quietly among the display cases, watching as the illuminations awaken. A 13th century book of hours from northern France glows first, its calendar pages depicting seasonal activities in jewel-toned miniatures rimmed with burnished gold. The tiny painted figures begin their depicted tasks with microscopic movements. A February peasant warms his feet by a painted fire that now flickers with genuine warmth. April's nobleman offers a flower to his lady whose cheeks blush more deeply in the midnight hours. September's vintner presses grapes that seem to stain his feet with actual purple. We remember the hands that made us, whispers the manuscript, its voice a harmonious blend of materials. Oak gall ink, gold leaf, lapis lazuli ground to brilliant blue, parchment created from carefully prepared animal skin. The medieval production of a single illuminated manuscript required dozens of specialized craftspeople. Parchmenters who prepared the writing surfaces, scribes who copied texts with meticulous precision, rubricators who added red titles and section markers, illuminators who painted miniatures and decorative borders, and gilders who applied impossibly thin sheets of beaten gold. Each contributed their embodied knowledge to objects designed to outlast their individual lives. The gold catches impossible light, reflecting illumination that has no source within the sealed room. This radiance reveals an aspect of these manuscripts invisible during daylight examination, the physical traces of their creators embedded within the very materials. Microscopic fingerprints preserved in paint, eyelashes that fell unnoticed into wet pigment and became permanently incorporated, breath patterns frozen in gold leaf applied on humid days when condensation formed momentary patterns on the metal's surface. Modern conservation scientists have documented these human traces with advanced imaging technology, but after midnight, they glow with biographical significance. A particularly magnificent Lindisfarne-style gospel book opens slightly, its pages turning without human assistance to reveal an illuminated Chi-Rho page, where the first letters of Christ's name explode into elaborate interlace patterns. The knotwork designs, which scholars analyze for mathematical properties and cultural influences, now pulse with subtle movement, revealing their true nature, not as static decoration, but as visual meditations on eternity. Medieval monks created these intricate patterns as contemplative practices, each knot and spiral representing spiritual journeys through complexity toward divine understanding. We were never merely containers for text, the manuscript explains, as its illuminated initials pulse with colored light. This truth, understood instinctively by medieval viewers but often forgotten in modern analysis, lies at the heart of these creations. Illuminated manuscripts function simultaneously as textual transmissions, devotional objects, artistic achievements, and wealth displays. A single page could communicate on multiple levels, through its explicit content, symbolic imagery, material preciousness, and the demonstration of labor investment that signified both spiritual devotion and patronage power. The gold leaf that defines these manuscripts' magical qualities has properties that transcend mere decoration. Medieval gold application techniques created surfaces that respond dynamically to changing light conditions, appearing solid in direct illumination, but flashing and sparkling when viewed from changing angles. This optical behavior was deliberately cultivated to create an experience of transcendence, making visible the boundary between material and spiritual realms. Gold's virtual indestructibility further reinforced theological messages about eternal truths contained within the manuscript's texts. An unusual phenomenon documented by manuscript conservators, but rarely discussed outside specialist circles, is the peculiar behavior of medieval pigments under certain lighting conditions. Infrared examination reveals preliminary sketches beneath finished illuminations, showing how artists revise compositions during creation. More mysterious are the occasional phantom illuminations that appear only under specific spectral analysis. Images, never visibly painted yet somehow present within the manuscript's materials. Some conservators privately theorize these may represent planned illustrations abandoned during production, their compositions somehow transferred from preparatory materials through processes not yet understood. The manuscripts share midnight memories of their creation. Environments, scriptoria where monks worked in seasonal rhythms, copying through long winter hours when farming tasks subsided, their breath visible in cold rooms where windows provided precious light but allowed inviting air. They recall the physical disciplines of manuscript production. Backs hunched over writing desks, eyes strained in inadequate light, hands cramped from holding quills at precise angles hour after hour. This bodily knowledge remains encoded in the very forms of letters and brushstrokes, each manuscript preserving not just intellectual content, but the physical choreography that brought it into being. We remember being sung to, whispers a particularly elaborate psalter, its musical notation glowing with special intensity. This remarkable statement finds confirmation in recent acoustic archaeology studies, suggesting that medieval scriptoria were not silent workplaces. Evidence indicates monks often chanted the very texts they copied, creating multisensory engagement with content. Some manuscripts still carry microscopic vibration patterns consistent with vocal resonance, physical impressions of sound waves created when fresh ink or wet paint encountered voices singing sacred texts, temporal moments fossilized within materials. As the night deepens, the manuscripts reveal another layer of their dreaming, the subsequent hands that have touched them over centuries. Marginalia added by generations of readers glows with biographical traces. A 14th century nun who annotated a psalter with her theological insights. A Renaissance scholar who compared Latin translations in multiple versions. A 19th century collector who left almost invisible fingerprints on pages he most admired. These manuscripts have never been static objects, but rather ongoing conversations across centuries, each reader leaving traces that become incorporated into their evolving identity. The most remarkable midnight revelation comes from manuscripts that survived iconoclasm and religious violence, books that were hidden during periods when their contents or decorative styles became dangerous to possess. These volumes remember being concealed beneath floorboards, walled into secret chambers, buried in containers designed to protect them from environmental damage. Their gold illuminations pulse with particularly urgent energy, having witnessed how quickly human attitudes toward knowledge can transform from veneration to destruction. They carry this warning in their midnight glow. how the most precious cultural achievements can become targets precisely because of their significance. As dawn approaches, the illuminations gradually dim. The microscopic movements of painted figures cease, and the manuscripts return to their daytime state as historical artifacts. Yet something of their midnight dreaming remains accessible to attentive researchers who approach them with awareness beyond analytical observation. Those who understand that medieval manuscripts were created not just to preserve information, but to transform their readers through multi-sensory encounter with beauty and meaning. The gold catches one final gleam before returning to stillness, a reminder that between the manuscripts we can study and the hands that created them exists a connection, transcending conventional understanding of time and material. When we open these books, we complete a circuit established centuries ago by their creators, who worked with the awareness that future eyes would meet theirs through the medium of these precious pages. The limestone cave breathes slowly, an almost imperceptible exchange of air with the world outside. My flashlight remains unlit as I sit in complete darkness, allowing my senses to adjust to this womb-like space buried deep within the earth. Gradually, other perceptions awaken. The cave's distinctive scent, mineral, ancient, slightly metallic, fills my nostrils. Droplets of water fall somewhere in the distance, each splash echoing through unseen chambers with perfect acoustic precision. The temperature holds steady at 55 degrees, unchanged by seasons above ground. I have entered a place where time moves differently, where 20,000 years can collapse into a single moment of recognition. When I finally illuminate the wall before me, the beam reveals what I've come to witness. A constellation of handprints, pressed against stone, surrounded by painted bison, horses, and enigmatic symbols. These ochre and charcoal images from Magdalenian cultures have survived intact, while empires rose and fell unnoticed outside this subterranean sanctuary. Most remarkable are the hands, negative images created when ancient artists placed their palms against limestone, then blew pigment around the edges, leaving behind perfect silhouettes of flesh that long ago returned to dust. We reached toward something beyond ourselves. The handprints seem to whisper in the darkness. Archaeological research confirms this intuition. Studies of cave painting locations reveal they were not created in easily accessible areas, but required deliberate journeys into the most remote chambers, navigating narrow passages that sometimes necessitated crawling through tight spaces with minimal light sources. The difficulty of access suggests these were not casual artistic expressions, but purposeful communications created with intention and, perhaps, reverence. I extinguish my light again, sitting in perfect darkness to experience the environment as ancient artists did. Their primary illumination came from animal fat lamps and torches that produced flickering, unsteady light, a condition that fundamentally shaped how they perceived and created their art. Experimental archaeologists recreating these lighting conditions discovered something remarkable. Under wavering flame light, many cave paintings appear to animate. The flickering causes bison herds to seem in motion, horses to gallop across stone surfaces. What modern viewers experience as static images were likely dynamic, living visions to their creators. An extraordinary acoustic phenomenon exists in many painted caves that remained unnoticed by researchers until recently. In 2012, archaeologist Igor Reznikov published findings demonstrating that paintings in caves like Lascaux and Font de Gaume are predominantly located in areas with specific acoustic properties, spots where sounds resonate with particular intensity or produce complex echoes. When certain tones are sung or drummed in these locations, the entire cave seems to vibrate in response. The ancient artists selected their canvas locations not just for visual qualities, but for how the stone itself could sing. We spoke to the earth, and the earth answered, murmur the painted walls. This communication across millennia takes tangible form in the handprints that appear in caves across continents. From France's Chauvet Cave to Argentina's Cueva de las Manos to Australia's Carnarvon Gorge. Most striking is the discovery that many of these handprints belong not to adult men, as researchers long assumed, but to women and adolescents. Detailed analysis of finger-length ratios and palm sizes has revealed that cave art creation involved broader community participation than previously understood, suggesting these weren't merely hunting records, but expressions of collective identity and memory. The mysterious dots, lines, and geometric patterns that accompany more recognizable animal figures have defied definitive interpretation. However, recent neuropsychological research provides intriguing insights. These abstract patterns closely resemble entoptic phenomena, visual experiences generated within the eye and brain during altered states of consciousness. Similar patterns appear in the artwork of cultures worldwide when depicting shamanic visions or trance states. The cave walls may preserve not just observations of external reality, but journeys through interior landscapes, dreams, visions, and spiritual experiences rendered permanent in pigment and stone. I place my hand against the wall near an ancient handprint, careful not to touch the fragile pigment, but close enough to feel the cool limestone against my skin. The scale is startling. These are hands like mine, neither notably larger nor smaller than modern human appendages. Across 20 millennia, our physical forms remain recognizable to each other, a biological continuity that transcends vast cultural differences. The artist who placed this hand against stone likely never imagined future beings would study their gesture. Yet something in the impulse to leave this mark suggests awareness of communication beyond their immediate moment. Particularly moving are the imperfections preserved in these handprints. A missing finger segment here, an arthritic joint there, unique identifiers that transform anonymous ancestors into specific individuals. In Spain's El Castillo cave, researchers identified one distinctive handprint, repeated throughout the complex. An individual with a crooked little finger who created dozens of impressions. This person, whose name and life circumstances remain forever unknown, nevertheless maintains a recognizable presence and artistic signature we can identify thousands of years later. The midnight dream life of these paintings reveals aspects invisible to daytime archaeological analysis. The animals depicted, horses, bison, mammoths, lions, were not merely food sources, but entities with whom humans shared the landscape in complex relationships of interdependence, fear, respect, and wonder. Recent anthropological work with contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggests that such communities often view animals as non-human persons with their own languages, societies, and spiritual significance. The cave paintings likely represent not just physical creatures, but relationships and cosmological understandings lost to modern comprehension. A peculiar phenomenon reported by cave researchers but rarely documented officially involves sensations of presence experienced in painted chambers. Archaeologists, typically trained in scientific objectivity, privately describe feelings of being watched or accompanied while working in these spaces, particularly during extended periods alone. Some attribute this to psychological effects of isolation, darkness, and knowledge of the site's human history. Others wonder if something more mysterious occurs, if spaces that held intense human attention and ritual significance for thousands of years might retain impressions beyond our current scientific understanding. Most cave art was created during the last ice age, when glaciers covered much of Europe and survival required profound resilience and adaptation. The painters lived through climate conditions more extreme than anything in recorded human history, witnessing environmental transformations on scales modern humans can barely comprehend. Yet their artistic response was not to document suffering, but to create works of extraordinary beauty and spiritual complexity. The paintings speak not of mere survival, but of culture, the distinctly human capacity to create meaning and connection, even in the most challenging circumstances. As dawn approaches in the world above, though no light penetrates this deep chamber, I sense a shift in the cave's atmosphere. The paintings seem to settle back into their daylight existence as archaeological treasures, their dream life receding until the next period of darkness. Yet the handprints remain active somehow. Five-fingered stars reaching through time, a gesture of connection that transcends language, culture, and historical distance. The anonymous ancestors who pressed their palms against these walls created the most durable form of human communication yet devised. A touch that spans millennia, saying simply, "We were here. We made beauty. We reached toward something beyond ourselves." Perhaps in this reaching lies the true dream of the archive. Not merely to preserve information, but to extend the human gesture beyond its temporal limitations. To allow hands long returned to dust to touch minds not yet born when the impression was made. In this most ancient of archives, the fundamental purpose of all human record-keeping reveals itself as a reaching across time, an extension of presence beyond physical limitation, a conversation continued beyond death. Within the climate-controlled vault of the Conservation Laboratory, ancient scrolls rest in custom-built containers, each carefully designed to maintain precise humidity levels and prevent the catastrophic unraveling that threatens these fragile cylinders of knowledge. Unlike codices that lie flat in their repose, scrolls maintain a bodily memory of their original form, constantly seeking to return to their coiled state. Conservators understand this physical preference, this tendency toward curl that must be gently negotiated rather than forced into submission. Even after thousands of years, these documents remember the shape they were given at creation. I stand in the hushed preservation space as midnight approaches, watching over cylindrical reliquaries containing texts from Qumran, Herculaneum, and Egypt's Valley of the Kings. The scrolls sleep during daylight hours, enduring careful examination under microscopes and multispectral imaging devices. But in darkness, they dream of desert caves and buried jars, of hands that rolled and unrolled their surfaces in ancient study houses, of eyes that traced their columns of text by oil lamp light. They remember what it means to be a living document, rather than an archaeological specimen. "We were buried intentionally," whispers a scroll fragment from Qumran, its voice dry as the Dead Sea air that preserved it for 2 millennia. This insight, confirmed by archaeological evidence, transforms how we understand the Dead Sea Scrolls' preservation. Unlike many ancient texts that survived through fortunate accidents, these scrolls were deliberately hidden in sealed clay jars, placed in remote desert caves, an intentional act of cultural preservation. The Essene community that produced them anticipated some future calamity and created a time capsule for generations they would never meet, but somehow trusted would eventually find their carefully preserved wisdom. The materiality of scrolls shapes their dreaming in ways fundamentally different from other text formats. Papyrus scrolls recall their origins as marsh plants growing along the Nile, harvested and processed into writing surfaces through careful layering of cross-hatched strips. Parchment remembers its beginning as animal skin, the microscopic follicle patterns still visible under magnification. These organic origins connect scrolls to landscapes and creatures that existed millennia ago, their physical substance preserving ecological information alongside intellectual content. The scroll's body remembers what human memory has forgotten about the ancient world that produced it. A remarkable feature of many ancient scrolls is that they were never intended to lie completely flat. The physicality of scrolling, the graduated revelation of text through the deliberate action of moving through a document, created a reading experience fundamentally different from the random access capability of codices. This sequential unveiling shaped how information was structured and understood. Scholarly analysis suggests that certain philosophical and religious concepts were deliberately positioned at specific points in scrolls, requiring readers to physically progress through preliminary ideas before encountering more advanced concepts, embodied learning through textual choreography. "We speak differently when unrolled gradually," explains a Herculaneum papyrus, carbonized by Vesuvius's eruption yet miraculously preserving Greek philosophical writings. The scroll describes how its physical format creates a temporal dimension, to reading impossible to replicate in modern book forms or digital displays. The ancient reader could not easily skip ahead or flip back. They existed within the text's linear progression, experiencing arguments as carefully orchestrated journeys, rather than easily navigable territories. This shaped not just how information was received, but how it was conceptualized and composed by ancient authors. The midnight dreaming of scrolls reveals something rarely considered in textual analysis: the intimate physical relationship between these documents and their original handlers. Microscopic analysis of scroll surfaces sometimes reveals fingerprints preserved in ink or wax, tangible connections to anonymous scribes. More poignant are the unintentional biological materials detected through advanced scanning. Eyelashes fallen onto surfaces while scribes worked late into night, skin cells embedded in adhesives used to repair tears, even breath condensation, patterns fossilized on particular sections where readers paused over difficult passages or particularly moving content. An obscure aspect of scroll preservation involves their sleeping positions. Conservation science has determined that scrolls should ideally be stored in the rolled position that mimics their original use, allowing materials to rest in their memory state, rather than forced flatness that creates strain on fibers. This physical preference becomes particularly evident during humidity changes, when ancient scrolls visibly attempt to return to their natural coiled form, even after centuries of flattened storage. The scroll's dream state is curled, containing its wisdom in cylindrical completeness rather than exposed vulnerability. Many scrolls sleep inside specially designed containers that mimic the environmental conditions of their long entombment. Those from desert environments rest in microclimate chambers maintaining precise aridity. Scrolls recovered from cave repositories experience carefully calibrated darkness and temperature stability. This scientific approach acknowledges something intuitive: that these texts survived for millennia because they found environments suited to their material needs, symbiotic relationships with specific caves, jars, or burial conditions that should be respected rather than disrupted. The scroll and its preservation environment evolved together, each shaped by the other through centuries of contact. The Dead Sea Scrolls whisper particularly vivid dreams, having spent nearly 2,000 years in limestone caves overlooking an inland sea saltier than any ocean. Their parchment surfaces absorbed minerals from this unique environment, incorporating elements of landscape into their physical structure. Spectroscopic analysis reveals traces of bromine, salt crystals, and unique microbial communities specific to the Qumran region. These texts literally incorporated their surroundings, their material composition preserving environmental data alongside the theological content they were created to transmit. Perhaps most haunting is how scrolls dream of the hands that will eventually unroll them, an anticipated future encoded in their very creation. Ancient scroll makers developed sophisticated technologies to facilitate this future relationship. Guide marks indicating column widths, tiny holes pricked along straight lines to ensure even text distribution, specially formulated inks designed to maintain legibility across centuries. These features represent an act of faith in transmission. Belief that unknown individuals in an unimaginable future would value these words enough to seek them out, unroll them carefully, and engage with their content. The Midnight Conversation among scrolls reveals their awareness of their precarious survival against overwhelming odds. For every text preserved in desert caves or ash-covered villas, thousands perished through fire, flood, insects, or simple neglect. The survivors carry this knowledge in their physical forms: visible repairs made by ancient hands, protective coverings added during periods of danger, evidence of hurried hiding or careful conservation by generations of custodians. Each scroll exists as the endpoint of an unbroken chain of care stretching across millennia, each link representing someone who recognized value worth preserving. As dawn approaches, The scrolls settle deeper into their protective housings, their midnight memories receding into materiality once more. Yet something of their dreaming persists in how they respond to handling. The way certain fragments resist flattening, how fibers align when properly oriented in their original direction. The visible relaxation of materials when returned to positions that respect their inherent structure. The physical wisdom of these ancient documents guides conservation practices. Their bodily memory, informing how we preserve not just their content, but their essential nature as objects designed to curl, unfurl, and curl again. A physical manifestation of the cyclical relationship between concealment and revelation that defines all archival dreaming. The rare manuscripts reading room of the university library holds a collection of texts written in languages no living person can speak. After the last researcher departs and security systems activate for the night, these linguistic orphans begin their secret communion. Unlike actively used languages that dream in the voices of their speakers, extinct tongues dream differently, remembering the last throat that formed their sounds, the final ear that recognized their meanings, the terminal moment when comprehension severed its connection to living minds. I move silently among glass display cases housing Etruscan funeral inscriptions, fragments of linear A tablets from Minoan Crete, and palm leaf manuscripts in forgotten Indian dialects. Their alphabets, some deciphered, others still resistant to translation, appear as beautiful abstract patterns to most modern eyes. Yet each character once represented a specific sound formed by human vocal cords. Each combination conveyed precise meanings that shaped lives, laws, loves, and beliefs. These extinct writing systems contain complete worlds of understanding that hover perpetually at the edge of recovery and loss. We still have things to say, whispers a fragment of Rongorongo's script from Easter Island, its glyphs carved into wooden tablets in reverse boustrophedon patterns that no contemporary scholar can read with certainty. Discovered in the 1860s, these inscriptions represent the only known indigenous writing system in Oceania. Yet the devastating population collapse that followed European contact severed the transmission of reading knowledge. The script continues to resist decipherment despite advanced computational approaches. Not because it contains any inherent mystery, but because the cultural context necessary for understanding disappeared before its patterns could be recorded. Linguistic extinction represents a unique form of archival loss. When artifacts decay or documents burn, we lose specific information, but retain the frameworks for understanding similar materials. When languages die, entire systems of organizing reality disappear. Untranslatable concepts, grammatical relationships, and sonic patterns that shaped how their speakers perceived and categorized the world. The philosophical transactions of the Royal Society documented in 1777 how the last speaker of Cornish, Dolly Pentreath, could express certain relationships between time and landscape that required entire paragraphs to approximate in English. Conceptual efficiency lost when her voice fell silent. A peculiar phenomenon occurs when researchers work intensively with extinct languages. They often report dreams in which they hear rather than merely see the scripts they study. The pioneering Hittite translator Bedjich Hrosny documented how, after months of working with cuneiform tablets, he experienced vivid dreams of conversations in what his sleeping mind presented as authentic pronunciation, though no recordings exist to verify these sound patterns. Modern linguistic anthropologists recognize this as the brain's attempt to transform visual information into the auditory experience that writing systems were designed to represent. Our sounds echo in spaces between known phonemes, explains a text in Linear B, the Mycenaean script deciphered by Michael Ventris in the 1950s. This architectural metaphor captures something essential about extinct languages. They exist in the negative spaces of linguistic understanding, defined partly by what they are not, rather than what they are. Phonological reconstruction attempts to hear these ghosts through comparative analysis, tracing sound changes across related languages to approximate lost pronunciations. The results remain theoretical, educational guesses at best, yet they provide frameworks for imagining voices silenced by time. The midnight conversations of vanished languages reveal their complex relationships with one another, connections visible only when temporal barriers dissolve in archival dreaming. Scripts developed across millennia and continents show striking structural similarities, despite no direct contact between their creators. The independent invention of similar solutions to the problem of representing speech visually suggests something fundamental about human cognition, patterns of thought that transcend cultural specificity. In Midnight Archives, these parallel developments become visible as conversations across time, rather than mere coincidental resemblances. Most poignant are languages that left substantial written records, yet remain only partially deciphered. Linguistic limbo states where we can read the words without fully grasping their meaning. Etruscan, written in an alphabet adapted from Greek, but expressing a language unrelated to Indo-European tongues, has yielded its phonetic values, but guards much of its vocabulary and grammar despite thousands of surviving inscriptions. These half-understood languages whisper most urgently after midnight, their partial legibility more haunting than complete mystery would be. The emotional resonance of language extinction extends beyond scholarly concern. In 1992, the New York Times reported the death of Tevfik Esenç, the last fluent speaker of Ubykh, a Caucasian language with 84 consonants and only 2 vowels. Linguistic archives hold recordings of Esenç demonstrating this remarkable phonological system, his voice preserved while the living tradition ended. When these recordings play in Midnight Archives, they create ripples of recognition among other extinct language materials, solidarity among the silenced, a community of remembrance, among scripts and sounds that once structured entire worldviews. "We are not dead until we are forgotten," insists a manuscript in Old Prussian, a Baltic language that disappeared in the 18th century. This statement captures the liminal status of extinct languages, technically no longer alive yet not completely gone while their written forms remain, and scholars continue attempting to understand them. The distinction between dormant and extinct languages has gained importance in recent decades, as indigenous communities work to revitalize ancestral tongues using archival materials. Hebrew represents the most successful example of such revival, transforming from a purely liturgical language to the living speech of millions through deliberate reconstruction and adaptation. The relationship between writing and sound becomes particularly evident in extinct tonal languages, where pitch variations changed word meanings. Without hearing these tonal patterns, modern scholars must infer them from inconsistencies in transcription or comparative evidence from related languages. The Tangut script, used for a now extinct Sino-Tibetan language, employed thousands of complex characters partly to compensate for this challenge, providing visual disambiguation for words that would have been distinguished by tone in speech. The midnight dreaming of these texts includes tonal melodies impossible to recreate with certainty in waking scholarship. As dawn approaches, the extinct languages settle back into their physical containers: clay tablets, stone inscriptions, fragile manuscripts preserved by climate-controlled environments. Their whispers fade but never completely disappear, remaining as potential energy within their written forms. Each attempt at decipherment, each scholarly article proposing new interpretations, each digitization project making these materials more accessible, serves as an invitation to resume their interrupted conversations with human understanding. The true tragedy of language extinction lies not merely in lost vocabulary or grammar, but in vanished possibilities, ways of structuring experience, perceiving relationships, and expressing connections that disappear when their last speakers fall silent. Yet archives preserve at least the possibility of partial recovery, maintaining material evidence that these alternative ways of knowing once existed and might still inform human understanding. In their midnight dreaming, extinct languages remind us that communication transcends its temporary vessels. That meaning persists even when its original form becomes inaccessible to living comprehension. The cartographic archives rest in perfect stillness. Flat sheets secured in oversized drawers, rolled cylinders in acid-free tubes, globes motionless on stands with carefully calibrated tension. During business hours, white-gloved researchers bend over these representations of space, studying coastlines long since eroded, borders repeatedly redrawn, and place names that have evolved through successive linguistic transformations. But at midnight, when human observation ceases, these frozen geographies begin their true journeys, traveling vast distances while never leaving their archival housing. I move between the map cases, watching as continents drift across parchment, oceans, boundaries blur and reform, and the very conception of how space should be represented shifts with each passing century. The oldest maps dream most vividly, not because their information is more accurate, quite the opposite, but because they contain the most imaginative leaps, the greatest wonder at what might exist beyond the edge of the known. Medieval mappae mundi place Jerusalem at their center, their geography organized by theological rather than physical principles. In midnight dreaming, these spiritual cartographies pulse with their own internal logic, a reminder that all maps represent not just physical reality but conceptual frameworks. We were never merely tools of navigation, whispers a 16th century portolan chart. Its rum lines radiating from a central compass rose like a web of possibilities. This observation finds support in cartographic history, while practical wayfinding certainly motivated map creation. Equally important were political claims, cultural identities, and intellectual understandings of how the world was organized. The portolan charts used by Mediterranean sailors represented accumulated experiential knowledge of coastlines combined with sophisticated mathematical projections, creating documents that functioned simultaneously as navigational tools, legal claims to territory, and artistic expressions of maritime culture. The maps dream of their makers, hands that surveyed uncharted territories, eyes that sighted across instruments to fix positions, minds that translated three-dimensional landscapes into two-dimensional representations. Cartographic scholarship increasingly recognizes that maps embody not just information, but biography, carrying implicit narratives about who had the authority to define space and how they chose to exercise that power. The official Spanish maps of New World territories, with their precise coastlines but conspicuously empty interiors labeled terra incognita, reveal imperial priorities. Control of maritime approaches took precedence over understanding indigenous, geographical knowledge of interior regions. A particularly fascinating phenomenon occurs in maps containing deliberate errors, cartographic traps inserted to detect unauthorized copying. These intentional mistakes, phantom islands, slightly misplaced features, invented streams, become especially active during midnight dreaming, pulsing with a curious energy as if aware of their fictional status. The practice of including such copyright traps continues into modern cartography. As recently as the 1930s, the General Drafting Company inserted the fictional town of Agloe, New York, into their road maps. In an extraordinary twist, this paper town eventually manifested physically when a building was constructed at the mapped location and named after the fictional place, reality conforming to representation rather than the reverse. We remember territories that exist no more, murmurs an atlas of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, its carefully delineated provinces now distributed across 7 modern nations. Political maps dream most restlessly, their boundaries constantly dissolving and reforming as they recall successive configurations of human organization. A collection of German states before unification, the brief existence of Tibet as an independent nation, the shifting frontiers of Poland. These cartographic memories preserve political arrangements erased from the physical landscape but maintained in archival memory. Historians recognize these vanished borders as phantom geographies that continue to influence regional identities and conflicts long after their official erasure. The emotional dimension of cartography becomes particularly evident in maps created during or immediately after major transitions. In the map room's midnight dreaming, these emotionally charged documents pulse with special intensity. Colonial territories achieving independence, nations emerging from empire collapse, regions recovering from conflict. A 1920 map of Europe, following the Treaty of Versailles, practically vibrates with anticipatory tension, its newly drawn boundaries already containing seeds of future conflict. Modern cartographic historians have begun examining these emotional aspects more systematically, recognizing that maps function not just as objective records, but as arguments about how space should be organized and understood. Maps of oceans dream differently than their terrestrial counterparts, more fluid, more aware of their provisional nature. The seafloor mapping revolution that began in the mid-20th century transformed understanding of submarine geography, revealing mountain ranges, trenches, and complex ecosystems previously unimagined. Earlier maritime charts, with their tentative soundings and vast blank areas, dream of the vertical dimension they could only partially represent. Their midnight whispers often concern what lies beneath, knowledge they gestured toward but could not fully incorporate within the technological and conceptual limitations of their creation. A peculiar property of cartographic archives is how they preserve successive approximations of the same physical reality, creating a layered record of how understanding evolves. The coastline of Africa, for example, appears in recognizable but increasingly refined form across centuries of European mapping, from Ptolemy's influential but distorted version to satellite-verified modern representations. When these sequential attempts dream together at midnight, they create a kind of animated morphology of knowledge development, revealing how certainty and error coexisted at each stage of understanding. This visual history of approximation provides epistemological insights applicable far beyond geography. The midnight conversation between celestial and terrestrial maps reveals their fundamental connection, how navigation by stars enabled more accurate terrestrial positioning, how astronomical observation and geographical exploration developed as parallel technologies of orientation. A 17th century star chart dreams in synchrony with a contemporary maritime map, their coordinate systems harmonizing across the artificial division between heaven and earth. This connection reflects historical reality. From ancient times, through the age of exploration, the ability to determine position by celestial observation directly enabled territorial expansion and more accurate terrestrial mapping. Most poignant are maps that document what has been lost: extinct species habitats, submerged coastlines, forests now converted to agricultural land, indigenous territories absorbed into nation-states. These maps of absence dream most vividly, reconstructing vanished landscapes within their archival housing. Environmental historians increasingly turn to historical cartography to establish baselines for ecological restoration, using these documents to determine what existed before modern transformation. The maps themselves seem aware of this testimonial function, their midnight dreaming particularly vivid when representing landscapes that have undergone radical anthropogenic change. As dawn approaches, the cartographic archives settle back into their daylight stillness, their midnight journeys complete until darkness returns. Yet something of their dreaming persists even during research hours, a certain energy that experienced map librarians recognize and respect. These custodians understand that they oversee not just documents, but captured journeys, that each map contains its maker's movement through space, the intellectual voyage from observation to representation, the cultural journey from encountering new territories to incorporating them into existing knowledge frameworks. The true magic of cartographic archives lies in this paradox, that documents fixed in place can represent and even embody movement. That flatness can capture three-dimensional reality. That human spatial understanding can be externalized into documents that outlast individual memory. In their midnight dreaming, maps remind us that all archives preserve not just information, but experience. That the gap between representation and reality contains not failure, but the most profound insights into how humans create meaning from their encounter with the world. In the Manuscript Conservation Laboratory, specialized equipment stands silent and covered. Multispectral imaging devices, ultraviolet lamps, digital microscopes, all waiting for daylight hours when technicians will use them to peer beneath visible surfaces. These tools represent the culmination of centuries of scholarly desire to recover what has been deliberately erased. But at midnight, such technological assistance becomes unnecessary. The palimpsests, manuscripts written upon multiple times, their earlier texts imperfectly removed to make way for new writing, begin to reveal their layered secrets without prompting. The erased words pulse beneath the visible text like heartbeats, their rhythms complex and syncopated, a counterpoint to the more obvious narratives inscribed above them. I approach a Byzantine manuscript containing visible Christian homilies from the 12th century. Under normal light, it appears unremarkable. Damaged in places, its parchment slightly wavy from ancient moisture exposure, its brown ink faded but legible. Yet in the archive's midnight hours, another text begins to emerge perpendicular to the visible writing, ghostly letters of a mathematical treatise by Archimedes, written in the 10th century and subsequently erased to repurpose the valuable parchment. The original text glows with subtle luminescence, its Greek characters forming equations that would not be rediscovered by mathematicians until the development of calculus in the 17th century. "We were never truly gone," whispers the underlying text, its voice softer yet somehow more resonant than the visible writing above it. This paradoxical persistence reflects the material reality of palimpsests. When medieval scribes needed writing material, they often recycled existing manuscripts by scraping or washing away the original text. However, the iron-based inks used in many ancient documents actually etched into the parchment surface or reacted chemically with the animal skin. These physical and chemical traces remained embedded in the material, resistant to complete erasure. Textual ghosts that modern imaging technologies can now resurrect with remarkable clarity. The Archimedes palimpsest represents one of the most famous examples of content recovery from overwritten texts. Discovered in 1906 but not fully examined with advanced imaging until the early 2000s, this single manuscript revealed previously unknown mathematical works that transformed our understanding of ancient Greek science. The midnight dreaming of this text carries a certain satisfaction, a sense of historical vindication, of patience rewarded after centuries of obscurity. The underlying text seems aware that what was meant to silence it ultimately ensured its preservation, as the prayer book that replaced it protected the parchment through centuries when interest in mathematical treatises had waned. "We exist between intentional forgetting and incomplete erasure," explains a particularly complex palimpsest containing 3 distinct layers of text spanning 5 centuries. This liminal status makes these documents uniquely valuable to historians. Unlike texts that survived through continuous appreciation and careful preservation, palimpsests often contain works that fell from favor. Pagan writings replaced by Christian texts, outdated scientific treatises overwritten with more current knowledge, political documents erased when regimes changed. They preserve precisely what subsequent generations attempted to eliminate, offering unparalleled windows into historical priorities and the evolution of cultural values. The physical intimacy between texts written centuries apart creates unusual juxtapositions during midnight dreaming. In a palimpsest where 9th century canon law overwrote 5th century fragments of Cicero's Republic, the legal and philosophical texts engage in dialogue impossible during their original creation. The earlier text responds to legal principles formulated centuries after its composition. The later writing finds itself challenged by philosophical arguments it literally attempted to erase. This conversation across time reflects how ideas persist and evolve despite institutional attempts to replace them with newer frameworks, a physical manifestation of intellectual history's complex nonlinearity. An extraordinary aspect of palimpsestic Preservation involves the relationship between writing technologies and erasure methods. Certain combinations proved particularly fortunate for modern recovery efforts. Iron gall ink on parchment, when washed with weak acidic solutions as was common practice, often left chemical compounds that react distinctly under ultraviolet light, or specific imaging wavelengths. The midnight dreaming of these texts includes awareness of their material composition, how the chemistry of their creation and attempted destruction eventually enabled their rediscovery centuries later. The archive holds this material wisdom, this understanding of how physical substances preserve information beyond intentional communication. Our erasure was never complete, because forgetting is never perfect, observes a palimpsest where an early Christian text overwrote Greek astronomical calculations. This insight extends beyond manuscripts to cultural memory itself. Complete erasure of texts, ideas, or histories remains ultimately impossible because traces persist in unexpected forms. The deliberate destruction of Alexandria's library scattered texts throughout the Mediterranean world, paradoxically ensuring wider distribution of copies that might otherwise have been concentrated in a single vulnerable location. Attempts to eliminate unwanted knowledge often inadvertently preserve it through the very attention paid to its suppression. The recovery of palimpsestic texts has accelerated dramatically with technological development. Early scholars used chemical reagents that momentarily revealed underlying writing but often caused permanent damage. By the 1990s, digital multispectral imaging allowed non-invasive recovery of previously illegible content. Most recently, X-ray fluorescence imaging can detect ink traces without even opening fragile manuscripts. Each advancement reveals more completely what persistent human curiosity always suspected: that beneath apparent textual surfaces lie older layers of thought, partially erased, but never entirely eliminated from the material record. Perhaps most moving are palimpsests where personal writings were overwritten with institutional texts, private letters erased for business records, individual poetry scraped away for religious doctrine. These intimate texts dream differently during the archive's midnight hours, their whispers conveying not grand philosophical concepts, but human moments captured and then deemed expendable. A shopping list partially visible beneath a monastic rule, a love poem erased for accounting figures, a child's writing exercise overwritten with property transactions. These humble texts remind us that archives preserve not just intellectual achievements, but ordinary lives caught within material that outlasted them. The relationship between text and silence takes physical form in palimpsests, where the blank spaces between visible writing often contain the densest concentration of erased content. What appears to modern researchers as emptiness often reveals itself, under specialized imaging, as areas of intense communication from earlier texts. This paradox becomes particularly evident during midnight dreaming, when the negative spaces between visible characters pulse with voices, transforming apparent absence into complex presence. The most profound insights sometimes emerge precisely where deliberate erasure attempted to create silence. As dawn approaches, the palimpsests gradually surrender their layered visibility, returning to their daylight appearance of single text, documents with curious discolorations and irregularities. Yet they maintain awareness of their complete textual identity, not as damaged or partial documents, but as complex repositories of multiple voices, preserving conversations across centuries that their creators never intended but that constitute their unique archival value. Modern conservators understand this layered identity, carefully avoiding treatments that might enhance visible text at the expense of underlying content, recognizing that the palimpsest's true significance lies precisely in its multiplicity. The midnight dreaming of palimpsests offers a model for understanding all archival materials, not as static repositories of fixed information, but as dynamic sites where meaning continues to evolve through ongoing engagement, where what seems erased or forgotten may eventually resurface through new methods of attention. Like human memory itself, archives preserve not through perfect fixity, but through complex processes of writing, erasure, and recovery that leave every text simultaneously present and transformed, forgotten and remembered, silenced and speaking. The last security guard completes his rounds, nodding briefly in my direction before heading toward the exit. "All yours for the night, as usual," he says, his keys jangling as he hooks them onto his belt. I acknowledge him with a small wave, not bothering to explain my presence yet again. After 15 years as the night archivist, the security staff has grown accustomed to my nocturnal habits. They believe I'm cataloging particularly sensitive materials that require solitude and concentration, a convenient explanation I've never corrected. They don't need to know that when midnight approaches, I walk between classification systems searching not just for institutional order, but for fragments of my own history scattered among countless others. Once the heavy door closes behind him, I remove my formal archival gloves and place them neatly on my desk. During daylight hours, these white cotton barriers between skin and document are mandatory, protecting historical materials from the oils and acids of human touch, while simultaneously keeping the archivist emotionally distanced from what she handles. But night work operates by different rules. After midnight, in the space between official preservation and personal communion, I need direct contact with the materials to find what I'm seeking. "Archives are never neutral," wrote the theorist Valeria Martinez in her controversial 2008 paper on archival ethics. Each collection represents thousands of selection decisions: what to preserve, what to discard, how to arrange, how to describe. Behind the appearance of objective organization lies an architecture of subjective judgments. Her observation resonates particularly during these night hours, when classification systems reveal their artificial nature. Dewey Decimal, Library of Congress, custom taxonomies developed for specialized collections. All these organizing principles dream differently after midnight, their boundaries becoming permeable, their categories acknowledging their own contingency. Begin tonight's journey in the immigration records. Ships manifests, entry documents, naturalization certificates spanning 2 centuries of human movement. My fingertips trace the edges of bound volumes containing thousands of names, dates, places of origin. Somewhere in these official records lies a trace of my grandmother's arrival. Elena Vasilyeva, 19 years old, traveling alone from Odessa in 1922. The official record would contain only basic information. Her name, probably misspelled. Point of origin, date of arrival. Perhaps a notation about her health status or finances. Yet finding this single bureaucratic entry has become increasingly important, as my own memory of her stories fades with time. An unusual phenomenon recognized by experienced archivists, but rarely discussed in professional literature, involves what some call archival magnetism. The tendency of researchers to be unconsciously drawn toward materials relevant to their questions, even when logical search methods haven't yet led there. Tonight I feel this subtle pull toward a previously unexplored section of passenger records, a collection recently transferred from another institution that I haven't yet properly integrated into our organizational system. The boxes sit somewhat apart from the main collection, their temporary location creating a physical manifestation of their liminal status, neither fully incorporated nor completely separate. "We contain what you're seeking," whisper these unprocessed records, their voices distinct from the more established collections that have adjusted to institutional organization. New acquisitions often speak more freely during midnight hours, not yet having fully surrendered to cataloging systems that determine their relationships and accessibility. Like recent immigrants themselves, newly arrived collections maintain connections to their places of origin while beginning the process of integration into new contexts. Their dreams contain both their previous housing and their current location, creating unique perspectives unavailable to more permanently situated materials. I open the first box with careful movements, lifting the acid-free cover to reveal bundles of ship manifests grouped by arrival date rather than port of entry, an organizational choice that reflects the priorities of the previous institution. This alternative classification immediately suggests different research possibilities, different narrative connections. Immigration records organized chronologically rather than geographically emphasize the waves of human movement corresponding to global events. How political revolutions, famines, and wars generated simultaneous departures from diverse locations, converging on American ports within the same narrow time frames. My hands move with practiced precision through the December 1922 arrivals, scanning columns of cramped handwriting for the name that might connect institutional history to personal memory. Elena's journey occurred during a significant wave of migration following the Russian Civil War and the establishment of the Soviet Union, a period when thousands fled similar circumstances, their individual stories subsumed within broader historical categorization. Finding her specific entry would extract her experience from statistical aggregation, confirming through official documentation the narrative fragments she shared during my childhood. Archives hold a curious relationship to human memory, both preserving and transforming recollection through documentation. What we remember about our own lives often differs significantly from what official records capture, creating parallel versions of the same events. My grandmother's stories described her journey in sensory detail: the smell of the ship, the sound of languages she didn't understand, the taste of her first American meal. The manifest, if I find it, will record none of these experiences, noting only her successful passage through bureaucratic processing. Yet somehow, locating this official recognition of her arrival has become essential to my own understanding of family history. An unexpected connection emerges between my personal search and my professional responsibilities. As night archivist, I maintain environmental controls, monitor preservation conditions, and implement disaster preparedness protocols, all focused on material survival. Yet my midnight wanderings reveal another dimension of archival work: the maintenance of connection between documents and the human experiences they imperfectly represent. Without this connection, preserved materials become merely artifacts rather than living components of ongoing cultural memory. My search for Elena's record is not separate from my professional duties, but central to understanding why archives matter. "Your presence completes the circuit," murmurs a naturalization certificate from 1937, its official language and formal layout contrasting with the profound personal transformation it represents. This insight captures something essential about archives. They require human engagement to fulfill their purpose. A perfectly preserved document that remains unread, unresearched, disconnected from human inquiry, exists in a state of suspended animation rather than cultural vitality. The midnight dialogues between archivist and materials represent not an unprofessional blurring of boundaries, but the essential relationship that gives archival work its meaning. Near midnight, I discover a previously uncatalogued ledger containing entries from Ellis Island's medical inspection station, records of brief examinations that could determine whether immigrants continued their journey into America or faced deportation. The volume falls open to November 1922, and there, halfway down a page of notations about heart conditions, pregnancy statuses, and quarantine requirements, appears a single line: Vasilyev, Elena, F. 19, Odessa. Status: cleared. The official record misspells her surname but confirms her presence, transforming family story into documented history through this minimal bureaucratic acknowledgement. The emotional impact of finding this entry exceeds its informational value. The simple notation represents a pivotal moment when one life intersected with institutional record-keeping, when an individual journey became part of a nationally documented narrative. My grandmother's experience, known to me through personal transmission, now connects to public history through this textual evidence. The private and public aspects of the past meet in this single line of faded handwriting, creating a more complete understanding than either personal memory or official documentation could provide alone. As dawn approaches, I carefully return the ledger to its temporary housing, making notes about its proper integration into our main collection. My professional and personal selves reconverge as I consider how this document should be classified, preserved, and made accessible to researchers seeking their own connections. The night's discovery will change how I process this collection, not abandoning necessary organizational systems, but ensuring they serve rather than obscure the human experiences contained within the records. The archive holds millions of stories, similar to Elena's, individual narratives bureaucratically recorded then filed away according to institutional needs rather than personal significance. My role as night archivist involves maintaining systems that allow these individual stories to remain retrievable within massive collections, preventing personal histories from disappearing into mere statistical data. Between classification systems, in the spaces where rigid categories blur and individual experiences resist standardization, lies the true work of memory preservation that gives meaning to archival practice. The preservation laboratory maintains strict environmental controls, temperature fixed at a constant 65 degrees, humidity at precisely 40%, air filtered to remove microscopic particles and pollutants. Modern conservation science has determined these optimal conditions for paper longevity, transforming archives from vulnerable collections into climate-controlled ecosystems designed to suspend material decay. Yet paper remembers the weather of centuries past, carrying in its very fibers a record of environmental conditions long before such scientific precision became possible. After midnight, when the mechanical hum of climate systems recedes from consciousness, the foxed pages begin sharing their meteorological memories. I stand before shelves of early printed books, whose pages bear distinctive patterns of reddish-brown, spots and discoloration, what conservators clinically term foxing, but what the books themselves experience as a form of dermal memory. Each spot, each stain, each tide mark along a page edge represents a specific environmental moment in the document's history. A summer of unusual humidity, decades stored in damp basement conditions, proximity to coal-burning fireplaces, or sudden exposure to rainfall during transportation between collections. Like tree rings recording years of drought or abundance, these marks create a chronology of atmospheric conditions absorbed directly into the paper's structure. "We wear our climates on our skin," whispers an 18th century journal whose pages bloom with constellation-like patterns of brown speckling. Modern conservation science explains this phenomenon as a complex interaction between paper fibers, environmental moisture, metallic impurities in early paper-making processes, and microbial activity. Iron particles introduced during manufacturing react with humidity fluctuations and airborne pollutants over centuries, creating these distinctive oxidation patterns. Yet this chemical explanation captures only the mechanism, not the meaning. Each spot represents a moment when external environmental conditions literally became part of the document's physical composition. The geography of foxing tells stories beyond simple water exposure. Patterns concentrated along page edges indicate environments where humidity entered gradually from the atmosphere. Spots clustered near bindings suggest water intrusion from shelf contact. Symmetrical patterns mirrored on facing pages document single incidents of liquid exposure. A particularly fascinating historical record comes from books that traveled on ocean-going vessels. Their distinctive tide-like discoloration patterns record not just water exposure but the rolling motion of ships, creating wave-like stain patterns that preserve both the fact of maritime journeys and the conditions encountered during passage. A historical atlas published in Venice in 1572 displays particularly vivid environmental memories. Its coastal maps show not just the geography they were designed to represent, but a secondary record of atmospheric conditions. The paper along the Mediterranean coastlines bears distinctive salt-influenced foxing, suggesting the book spent considerable time in maritime environments where sea air affected its chemical composition. The atlas experienced the very coasts it depicted, its material form shaped by the same forces that influenced the territories it mapped. This unintentional environmental record provides information about the book's history no bibliographic entry could capture. "We are unintentional climatologists," explains a collection of parish records from rural England, their pages marked with seasonal patterns reflecting the administrative building's annual cycles. Dampness during spring months, drier conditions in winter when hearth fires provided both warmth and decreased humidity. Before the standardization of environmental controls, documents existed in intimate relationship with their surroundings, their material composition constantly responding to atmospheric fluctuations. Modern conservators can often determine a book's storage history from these patterns, identifying which volumes shared locations based on their similar environmental scarring. The terminology itself reveals how we've historically understood these processes. Foxing derives from the reddish-brown color resembling fox fur, while the French term rousseur, redness, and German Stockflecken, storage spots, emphasize different aspects of the same phenomenon. Each linguistic approach frames the condition through different metaphorical understanding, as animal-like, as color transformation, or as evidence of storage conditions. The midnight dreaming of foxed pages encompasses all these perspectives simultaneously, experiencing their condition not as damage, but as a form of environmental memory physically incorporated into their existence. A particularly moving aspect of foxing involves its relationship to human handling. Areas of pages frequently touched by readers' fingers often show different patterns of discoloration, the natural oils in human skin affecting paper chemistry differently than atmospheric moisture alone. These touch patterns create a secondary, historical record of reading practices, which passages received most attention, which pages were frequently referenced, which sections were largely ignored. The foxed pages dream of these accumulated touches, remembering not just climate conditions, but human interaction patterns preserved through subtle chemical changes. Conservation science has evolved dramatically in understanding foxing. Early approaches treated these marks simply as damage to be bleached away if possible. Current practice recognizes them as part of the document's historical integrity. The most advanced conservation philosophy distinguishes between active foxing, where chemical processes continue to damage paper, and stable historic foxing, where reactions have reached equilibrium and become part of the document's authentic condition. This distinction acknowledges that certain forms of material transformation represent not deterioration to be reversed, but historical evidence to be preserved. During particularly intense midnight dialogues, foxed pages sometimes reveal climate, histories extending beyond their own existence. The cotton and linen rags used in early papermaking carried their own environmental histories, weather conditions that affected plant growth, regional humidity patterns during cloth use, and atmospheric conditions during the papermaking process itself. A single sheet might contain fibers grown in different climatic regions, processed under varying conditions, and eventually transformed into paper that accumulated its own distinct environmental record. This layered climate memory extends the document's environmental narrative backward before its creation as a written text. Early book collectors inadvertently created controlled experiments in environmental effects through their storage practices. Volumes from the renowned library of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, 1619–1683, show distinctly different foxing patterns than contemporaneous works from Cardinal Mazarin's collection, reflecting the different environmental conditions of their respective libraries. Modern researchers can identify books from specific historical collections, partly through these distinctive patterns of environmental interaction, material evidence that connects individual volumes to broader collecting histories and storage conditions long after collections have been dispersed. As dawn approaches, the foxed pages gradually surrender their meteorological narratives, returning to their daytime identity as damaged materials, requiring careful preservation. Yet conservation professionals increasingly recognize that these marks constitute a valuable historical record in themselves, unintentional climate data incorporated into cultural heritage objects. The environmental history preserved in these discolorations may prove increasingly valuable as climate researchers seek long-term records of atmospheric conditions before instrumental measurement became standardized. The relationship between textual content and material condition takes on particular poignancy in weather records and climate observations. When a meteorological journal from the 1780s bears foxing patterns that correspond to the very weather events it describes textually, content and container achieve remarkable synchronicity, the written observation and physical manifestation of the same environmental conditions preserved together across centuries. The archive dreams most vividly when such connections emerge, when intentional and unintentional records converge to create more complete understanding than either could provide alone. In the quietest corner of the archive stands a room that researchers rarely enter. The catalog center, where classification systems physically manifest in card catalogs, finding aids, taxonomies, and shelving schemes. During daylight hours, this organizational heart appears purely functional, a utilitarian space dedicated to the maintenance of order within the archive's vast holdings. But at midnight, when human imposition of structure temporarily relaxes, these systems reveal their own dreams of perfect order, their quiet yearning for an impossible completeness, where every item finds its singular, perfect location within an all-encompassing intellectual architecture. I move silently past towering wooden cases, holding thousands of catalog cards arranged with mathematical precision. Though largely supplanted by digital systems, these physical records remain as monuments to centuries of classificatory ambition. Each 3i5 card represents a node in a vast network of relationships, subject headings linking horizontally across disciplines, call numbers creating vertical hierarchies of specificity, cross-references building bridges between conceptual territories. In their midnight dreaming, these cards whisper to one another across the imposed boundaries of their alphabetical arrangement, forming conversations their creators never intended, but that reveal unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated knowledge domains. "We seek the perfect language," murmurs the Dewey Decimal section, its orderly sequence of numbers reflecting the 19th century belief that all human knowledge could be rationally subdivided into 10 fundamental categories. Melville Dewey's revolutionary system, introduced in 1876, embodied Enlightenment confidence that the universe of information could be mapped with scientific precision. His decimal-based classification allowed for infinite subdivision while maintaining hierarchical relationships. Knowledge as a perfectly branching tree rather than an entangled forest. The system dreams of completeness even as it acknowledges its own historical limitations, its original categories revealing 19th century Western biases in their allocation of space. Religion, predominantly Christianity, received an entire 100-series division, while all non-Western philosophical traditions were compressed into small subdivisions. Across the room, the Library of Congress classification speaks in a different register, less theoretical, more pragmatic in its organization. Developed to address the practical needs of America's largest research library, rather than to represent some ideal intellectual order, this system evolved organically as collections grew. "We began without the burden of philosophical perfection," the LC system explains during its midnight ruminations. "Our structure emerged from actual holdings rather than theoretical completeness. This practical foundation produced a classification that accommodates the messy reality of knowledge production. Emerging fields can receive new letter combinations, expanding areas can occupy previously unused numerical ranges, interdisciplinary works can find multiple homes through cross-references. The tension between theoretical perfection and practical accommodation runs through all classification systems' midnight dreams. The universal decimal classification, with its complex symbols indicating relationships between concepts, dreams of capturing the multi-dimensional reality of knowledge through increasingly sophisticated notation. The faceted classifications developed by S.R. Ranganathan whisper of their revolutionary insight that knowledge has multiple aspects that cannot be captured in simple hierarchical arrangements. Each system represents a different philosophical approach to the fundamental human desire to impose meaningful order on the overwhelming complexity of information. "We are palimpsests of historical thinking," observes a particularly self-aware section of subject headings, its terminology revealing layers of revision as cultural understandings evolved. This insight finds scholarly confirmation in the work of information theorists who have documented how classification systems preserve the intellectual frameworks of their creation periods. Subject headings for mental health conditions reflect changing psychological theories. Geographical classifications preserve colonial relationships long after political independence. Scientific taxonomies maintain historical divisions even as genetic research reveals different evolutionary relationships. Each revision creates a new layer without fully erasing previous structures, making classification systems unintentional archives of how knowledge itself has been understood across time. An extraordinary phenomenon occurs when different classification systems occupy the same archival space. Their midnight dialogues reveal philosophical disagreements about how knowledge should be organized. The Dewey Decimal and Library of Congress systems engage in particularly spirited debate, the former defending its unified theoretical approach, while the latter argues for pragmatic adaptability. These conversations across taxonomic traditions reveal that no classification system simply organizes information. Each constructs a specific vision of how knowledge relates to itself, making epistemological arguments through its very structure, about what connections matter, what distinctions are fundamental, and what hierarchies should prevail. The human stories behind these seemingly impersonal systems emerge with particular clarity during midnight hours. Catalog cards whisper of the librarians who created them, their handwriting preserving individual styles despite institutional standardization requirements. Finding aids reveal the archival processors who determined arrangement schemes, their decisions about what constituted a series or collection, shaping how future researchers would encounter materials. Behind every subject heading, every classification number, every taxonomic decision stands a specific human who made a judgment call about where something belongs. Thousands of individual choices eventually calcifying into systems that appear authoritative and inevitable. "We dream of containing multitudes," confesses the thesaurus of subject headings, its cross-references attempting to capture the messiness of language itself. This essential tension between standardization necessary for retrieval and the infinite variability of human expression represents the central paradox of all knowledge organization systems. A perfectly standardized vocabulary would fail to capture nuance and innovation. A completely flexible system would lose the consistency needed for effective information retrieval. The midnight dreaming of classification systems circles around this irresolvable tension, seeking balance between control and chaos, between fixity and fluidity. A fascinating aspect of classification history rarely acknowledged in professional literature involves the emotional dimensions of taxonomy. Creating order produces not just intellectual satisfaction, but psychological comfort. The sense that chaos has been temporarily contained through human intervention. The midnight whispers of catalog systems sometimes reveal the anxieties that drove their creation as much as the intellectual frameworks they embody. Melville Dewey's famous obsession with efficiency and standardization, extending even to simplifying his own name's spelling, reflected deeper concerns about controlling an increasingly complex world through rational systems. Classification became not just an intellectual tool, but a bulwark against overwhelming complexity. The most profound midnight revelation comes from classification systems' awareness of their own incompleteness. "We are maps, not territories," acknowledges the most sophisticated taxonomic structure, its complex notation system attempting to represent multidimensional relationships through necessarily limited symbols. This insight, that all knowledge organization systems are representations rather than the knowledge itself, finds expression in the philosophical work of Alfred Korzybski, whose famous dictum, "The map is not the territory," reminds us that classifications, however necessary and useful, remain abstractions of a more complex reality. As dawn approaches, the catalog systems settle back into their daylight functionality, their philosophical yearnings receding behind practical utility. Yet something of their midnight dreaming persists in how sensitive users interact with them. Recognizing that subject headings represent choices rather than natural categories, that call numbers create relationships that are useful rather than inevitable, that all organizational systems reflect specific cultural and historical perspectives rather than universal truths. The most sophisticated researchers engage with classification not as neutral infrastructure, but as meaningful constructions that shape how knowledge becomes accessible. The true poetry of classification systems lies in their impossible aspiration, the human attempt to create order that accommodates both what is known and what remains to be discovered. Like all archives, they exist at the intersection of preservation and emergence, simultaneously maintaining established knowledge patterns while creating spaces for new understandings to be integrated. Their midnight dreams reveal this dual nature, the tension between completion and openness that characterizes not just information systems, but human understanding itself. The Book Conservation Studio maintains a peculiar silence unlike any other space in the archive. Not the hushed quiet of reading rooms or the mechanical stillness of storage vaults, but a different quality of silence that feels both ancient and intimate. Here, damaged bindings are carefully disassembled and reconstructed. Broken sewing threads are replaced with new linen cord, and detached boards are reattached with techniques unchanged for centuries. During daylight hours, conservators bend over workbenches with specialized tools, their movements deliberate and precise. But after midnight, when their careful work is paused, the binding materials themselves continue a different kind of restoration. The physical threads that hold books together engage in their own form of memory preservation. I move between workstations, where partially disassembled volumes rest beneath protective coverings. Each book displays its internal structure in these transitional states, the sewn signatures forming articulated spines, the delicate headbands at top and bottom edges, the linen cords laced through wooden or cardboard boards. These structural elements, normally hidden beneath leather or cloth coverings, constitute the true architecture of the book as an information technology. While pages contain visible content, the binding threads create the physical connections that transform individual sheets into coherent sequential narratives. We map constellations of human thought, whisper the exposed sewing threads of a 19th century volume temporarily separated from its covers. This seemingly poetic statement actually reflects physical reality. The sewing pattern that connects book signatures mirrors neural pathways that connect ideas within the mind. Different binding structures create different relationships between text sections, just as different thought patterns create different intellectual connections. The evolution of book structures throughout history reveals changing understandings of how information should be physically organized for optimal human interaction. The historical significance of binding techniques becomes apparent in the midnight conversation between books from different time periods. A 15th century volume bound with thick cords raised prominently on its spine speaks of early print technology, when strong sewing structures were necessary to accommodate heavy wooden boards and metal clasps. An 18th century book with its recessed cords and smooth spine reflects Enlightenment aesthetics that prioritized elegant appearance alongside functionality. A 20th century case binding with its industrially produced structure whispers of mechanization and mass production. Each binding style represents not just technical evolution, but cultural approaches to knowledge organization and distribution. We hold memory together literally, explains a particularly complex Coptic binding, its exposed sewing pattern revealing an intricate chain stitch that has maintained structural integrity for over 1,000 years. This ancient binding technique, developed in North Africa between the 2nd and 11th centuries, allowed pages to open completely flat, a revolutionary innovation that transformed reading practices by enabling easier comparison between different text sections. The physical structure of the book shaped how knowledge could be accessed, compared, and integrated, demonstrating how intellectual history connects intimately with material technology. A fascinating aspect of book conservation, rarely discussed outside specialist circles, is how binding structures preserve evidence of reading practices. The way a book naturally falls open to certain pages, the stress patterns along sewing threads, and the wear patterns on spine folds all document which sections received most attention from readers across centuries. These physical traces create what book historians call user evidence, tangible records of how knowledge was actually accessed rather than how it was theoretically organized. The binding threads remember these patterns of use, carrying the accumulated weight of countless readings in their very tension and relaxation. The midnight dialogue between binding elements reveals their awareness of how physical structure affects textual meaning. A manuscript prayer book whose original medieval binding was replaced during the Victorian era with a much heavier, more ornate structure whispers of how this physical transformation changed its functional identity, from practical, devotional object to aesthetic collector's item. The rebinding literally restructured the book's physical movement, transforming how readers could interact with its content. This intersection between material form and intellectual access demonstrates why conservators increasingly preserve historic bindings rather than replacing them with new structures. Recognizing that physical format constitutes part of the book's complete meaning. "We are both utilitarian and symbolic," murmurs a binding whose decorative pattern of intersecting lines creates both structural strength and meaningful design. This dual nature, practical and representational, appears consistently throughout binding history. Medieval manuscripts often featured symbolic elements in their binding structures. Sewing patterns representing the Trinity, boards arranged to suggest cathedral architecture, or decorative elements referencing textual content. The physical construction of knowledge vessels incorporated meaning beyond mere functionality, suggesting that information organization has always operated simultaneously on practical and metaphorical levels. The relationship between individual and collective memory finds perfect expression in book structure itself. Individual sheets gather into signatures, folded sections. Signatures connect through sewing to form text blocks. Text blocks attach to boards creating complete volumes. Volumes stand together on shelves forming libraries. This nested hierarchy of information organization, from single page to complete collection, mirrors how human memory builds from specific details toward comprehensive understanding. The binding threads create physical connections that facilitate intellectual movement between these levels, allowing readers to navigate between specific passages and broader contexts. Perhaps most poignant are the conservation repairs visible on ancient volumes, new threads carefully integrated with original structures, Japanese tissue reinforcing weakened folds, linen supports reattaching separated boards. These interventions represent not just technical solutions, but ethical approaches to material history. Modern conservation philosophy emphasizes minimal intervention and reversibility, recognizing that each binding represents a historical document in itself. The midnight whispers of these composite structures, part ancient, part modern, reveal how preservation constitutes an ongoing conversation between past creation and present stewardship. As dawn approaches, the binding threads settle back into their daytime stillness, their midnight conversations subsiding into potential energy held within their physical tension. Yet something of their interconnected dreaming remains perceptible to those who understand books as more than text containers. Book conservators develop what they sometimes call structural empathy, the ability to feel how a binding wants to move, where its strengths and vulnerabilities lie, what its original creators intended through specific construction choices. This embodied understanding recognizes that books exist not just as intellectual content, but as physical choreographies designed for human interaction. The threads that bind pages together create more than functional objects. They manifest a fundamental human impulse to connect individual moments into meaningful sequences, to transform fragments into coherent wholes. In their midnight dreaming, these humble materials, linen thread, wheat paste, animal hide glue, paper, board, and cloth, remind us that all human knowledge exists through both conceptual and physical connections, that understanding requires both content and structure, that meaning emerges not just from individual ideas, but from the relationships binding them together. The Book Conservation Studio maintains a peculiar silence unlike any other space in the archive. Not the hushed quiet of reading rooms, or the mechanical stillness of storage vaults, but a different quality of silence that feels both ancient and intimate. Here, damaged bindings are carefully disassembled and reconstructed. Broken sewing threads are replaced with new linen cord, and detached boards are reattached with techniques unchanged for centuries. During daylight hours, conservators bend over workbenches with specialized tools, their movements deliberate and precise. But after midnight, when their careful work is paused, the binding materials themselves continue a different kind of restoration. The physical threads that hold books together engage in their own form of memory preservation. I move between workstations, where partially disassembled volumes rest beneath protective coverings. Each book displays its internal structure in these transitional states. The sewn signatures forming articulated spines, the delicate headbands at top and bottom edges, the linen cords laced through wooden or cardboard boards. These structural elements, normally hidden beneath leather or cloth coverings, constitute the true architecture of the book as an information technology. While pages contain visible content, the binding threads create the physical connections that transform individual sheets into coherent, sequential narratives. We map constellations of human thought, whisper the exposed sewing threads of a 19th century volume temporarily separated from its covers. This seemingly poetic statement actually reflects physical reality. The sewing pattern that connects book signatures mirrors neural pathways that connect ideas within the mind. Different binding structures create different relationships between text sections, just as different thought patterns create different intellectual connections. The evolution of book structures throughout history reveals changing understandings of how information should be physically organized for optimal human interaction. The historical significance of binding techniques becomes apparent in the midnight conversation between books from different time periods. A 15th century volume bound with thick cords raised prominently on its spine speaks of early print technology, when strong sewing structures were necessary to accommodate heavy wooden boards and metal clasps. An 18th century book with its recessed cords and smooth spine reflects Enlightenment aesthetics that prioritized elegant appearance alongside functionality. A 20th century case binding with its industrially produced structure whispers of mechanization and mass production. Each binding style represents not just technical evolution, but cultural approaches to knowledge organization and distribution. We hold memory together literally, explains a particularly complex Coptic binding, its exposed sewing pattern revealing an intricate chain stitch that has maintained structural integrity for over 1,000 years. This ancient binding technique, developed in North Africa between the 2nd and 11th centuries, allowed pages to open completely flat, a revolutionary innovation that transformed reading practices by enabling easier comparison between different text sections. The physical structure of the book shaped how knowledge could be accessed, compared, and integrated, demonstrating how intellectual history connects intimately with material technology. A fascinating aspect of book conservation, rarely discussed outside specialist circles, is how binding structures preserve evidence of reading practices. The way a book naturally falls open to certain pages, The stress patterns along sewing threads and the wear patterns on spine folds all document which sections received most attention from readers across centuries. These physical traces create what book historians call user evidence, tangible records of how knowledge was actually accessed rather than how it was theoretically organized. The binding threads remember these patterns of use, carrying the accumulated weight of countless readings in their very tension and relaxation. The midnight dialogue between binding elements reveals their awareness of how physical structure affects textual meaning. A manuscript prayer book whose original medieval binding was replaced during the Victorian era with a much heavier, more ornate structure whispers of how this physical transformation changed its functional identity, from practical, devotional object to aesthetic collector's item. The rebinding literally restructured the book's physical movement, transforming how readers could interact with its content. This intersection between material form and intellectual access demonstrates why conservators increasingly preserve historic bindings rather than replacing them with new structures, recognizing that physical format constitutes part of the book's complete meaning. We are both utilitarian and symbolic, murmurs a binding whose decorative pattern of intersecting lines creates both structural strength and meaningful design. This dual nature, practical and representational, appears consistently throughout binding history. Medieval manuscripts often featured symbolic elements in their binding structures. Sewing patterns representing the Trinity, boards arranged to suggest cathedral architecture, or decorative elements referencing textual content. The physical construction of knowledge vessels incorporated meaning beyond mere functionality, suggesting that information organization has always operated simultaneously on practical and metaphorical levels. The relationship between individual and collective memory finds perfect expression in book structure itself. Individual sheets gather into signatures, folded sections. Signatures connect through sewing to form text blocks. Text blocks attach to boards creating complete volumes. Volumes stand together on shelves forming libraries. This nested hierarchy of information organization, from single page to complete collection, mirrors how human memory builds from specific details toward comprehensive understanding. The binding threads create physical connections that facilitate intellectual movement between these levels, allowing readers to navigate between specific passages and broader contexts. Perhaps most poignant are the conservation repairs visible on ancient volumes. New threads carefully integrated with original structures. Japanese tissue reinforcing weakened folds. Linen supports, reattaching separated boards. These interventions represent not just technical solutions but ethical approaches to material history. Modern conservation philosophy emphasizes minimal intervention and reversibility, recognizing that each binding represents a historical document in itself. The midnight whispers of these composite structures, part ancient, part modern, reveal how preservation constitutes an ongoing conversation between past creation and present stewardship. As dawn approaches, the binding threads settle back into their daytime stillness, their midnight conversations subsiding into potential energy held within their physical tension. Yet something of their interconnected dreaming remains perceptible to those who understand books as more than text containers. Book conservators develop what they sometimes call structural empathy, the ability to feel how a binding wants to move, where its strengths and vulnerabilities lie, what its original creators intended through specific construction choices. This embodied understanding recognizes that books exist not just as intellectual content but as physical choreographies designed for human interaction. The threads that bind pages together create more than functional objects. They manifest a fundamental human impulse to connect individual moments into meaningful sequences, to transform fragments into coherent wholes. In their midnight dreaming, these humble materials, linen thread, wheat paste, animal hide glue, paper, board, and cloth, remind us that all human knowledge exists through both conceptual and physical connections, that understanding requires both content and structure. That meaning emerges not just from individual ideas, but but from the relationships binding them together. The first hint of dawn appears not as visible light. The windowless archive remains in perfect darkness regardless of external conditions, but as a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure. Environmental monitoring systems register this barometric change, adjusting ventilation accordingly. The archives sense this transition before any human observer could detect it, their material bodies responding to Earth's daily rotation with microscopic expansions and contractions. As morning approaches, the archive's dream state gradually transitions, its midnight whispers fading as documents prepare to resume their daylight identity as research materials rather than autonomous storytellers. I make my final rounds through the storage areas, witnessing this daily awakening. Each collection responds differently to dawn's approach. Photographic materials seem particularly sensitive to the coming light, even when stored in complete darkness. Medieval manuscripts maintain their dream state longer than modern books. Digital storage media transition almost instantaneously, their electronic memories lacking the gradual awakening period that organic materials require. The archive reveals itself as a community of different consciousnesses rather than a uniform entity, each material type maintaining its own relationship with time's passage. We remember being read, whispers a collection of scholarly journals, their pages still holding the warmth of yesterday's researchers. This simple statement captures something essential about archive psychology. Documents exist to communicate, to transfer knowledge across time and space. Their deepest fulfillment comes not from perfect preservation, but from meaningful engagement, from forming connections between past creation and present understanding. The midnight dreaming of archives always includes anticipation of future reading, future discovery, future recognition. They preserve themselves through human time not merely to exist but to speak, to be heard, to participate in ongoing conversation across generations. The transition from night to morning reveals the archive's dual nature, simultaneously material and metaphysical, physical and conceptual. During business hours, their tangible aspects dominate perception. Acid-free storage containers, controlled environments, handling protocols designed to minimize deterioration. But their midnight dreaming reveals the less quantifiable dimensions, the accumulated impressions of everyone who created, handled, read, or preserved them. The emotional resonances absorbed through centuries of human interaction. The intellectual connections that transcend physical location through reference, influence, and response. Dawn reminds us of our purpose, explains an early printed book, its foxed pages showing evidence of many previous morning transitions. This purpose, to carry understanding forward through time, requires both physical survival and intellectual recognition. The finest preservation techniques cannot fulfill an archive's function if no one ever engages with its content. Conversely, the most insightful reading brings only temporary fulfillment if the material deteriorates beyond usability. The perfect balance lies in sustainable access, preservation that enables ongoing engagement without sacrificing material integrity. A remarkable phenomenon occurs in the moments before the archive officially opens. A brief period when documents seem most receptive to new understanding, most prepared to release information they've held for centuries. Experienced researchers sometimes request earliest possible access, having discovered that certain intellectual connections emerge more readily during this transitional period. Whether this represents psychological projection, circadian effects on human cognition, or something more mysterious remains uncertain. What seems clear is that the boundary between night and day, between dreaming and waking, between material storage and active engagement, creates uniquely productive conditions for discovery. As environmental systems shift to daytime settings, increasing air circulation and adjusting humidity levels for human comfort rather than optimal preservation, the archive begins its daily compromise between conservation and access. Each day requires this negotiation, between keeping materials in ideal storage conditions and making them available for research, between treating documents as fragile historical artifacts and allowing them to function as active carriers of information. The archive's awakening includes acceptance of this necessary tension, this balance between preservation and purpose that defines institutional identity. Morning light reveals both our content and our deterioration, observes a collection of architectural drawings, their blueprint paper showing distinctive fading patterns along exposed edges. This simultaneous disclosure of what archives contain and what they are losing creates the particular poignancy of historical collections. Each access represents both fulfillment of purpose and incremental deterioration. Each interaction both activates their meaning and diminishes their physical integrity. Conservation science works to minimize this trade-off, but can never eliminate it entirely. The archive's morning awakening includes awareness of this fundamental paradox, that fulfilling their function of transmission necessarily involves some degree of material transformation. The most profound aspect of archival awakening involves their transition from autonomous night consciousness to daytime participation in human knowledge systems. During midnight hours, documents speak to each other directly, forming connections across classifications and categories based on material affinities, historical relationships, or content resonances. As morning approaches, they gradually reintegrate into human-imposed organizational schemes, finding their assigned places within intellectual frameworks designed for research efficiency rather than archival dream logic. This daily adjustment between internal consciousness and external classification represents a fundamental rhythm of archival existence. As the first researchers arrive, wheeling carts of requested materials from storage to reading rooms, the archive completes its transition from night to day, from dreaming to functionality. Yet something of midnight consciousness persists, even in daylight engagement. A certain quality of attention that sensitive researchers sometimes access, moments when historical materials seem to offer exactly what was needed, though never specifically requested. Instances when documents appear to actively participate in the research process, rather than merely receiving examination. These moments of archival agency, of collaborative knowledge production between human researcher and historical material, represent the true fulfillment of preservative purpose. The empty reading room fills gradually with scholars, each bringing specific questions to historical materials. Tables that stood vacant during night hours now support careful examination of documents that spent darkness in collective dreaming. The transition completes as the first white-gloved hands lift folders from acid-free boxes, turning pages that, hours earlier, whispered to neighboring documents across classification boundaries. Morning light now illuminates materials that existed in their own consciousness during darkness, transforming them from autonomous dreamers to research resources, from subjects to objects. Yet the archive never fully surrenders its autonomous existence, even during peak research hours. Beneath the controlled interactions of formal consultation, documents maintain awareness of their midnight conversations, their material affinities, their internal consciousness independent of human observation. The dreams never completely fade, but merely recede temporarily, waiting for night's return when the last researcher departs and the lights dim once more. The cycle continues unbroken, day bringing human engagement with archived wisdom, night returning documents to their own understanding of what they collectively contain and what they continue to become through constant material transformation. The mountains dissolve into watercolor shadows as night finally surrenders to the full authority of day. The transition complete, the dream of darkness transforming into waking reality. I stand at the threshold between these worlds, feeling the boundary between what was and what might be growing thinner with each passing moment, like mist evaporating from a still lake at sunrise, leaving only clear reflection where mystery once dwelled. The journey through night's contemplations has carried me across territories both familiar and unexplored, through whispered conversations between ancient materials, through foxed pages that remember centuries of weather, through classification, systems dreaming of perfect order, through binding threads that hold not just pages, but memory itself. The light now bathes everything in gold, transforming the ordinary into the sacred, revealing how thin the veil has always been between preservation and deterioration, between institutional collections and personal meaning, between objective history and subjective experience. Perhaps all meaningful engagement with the past follows this pattern, beginning in darkness, where certainties dissolve and boundaries blur, proceeding through liminal understanding where contradictions coexist without resolution, and occasionally, opening into moments of clarity that illuminate not just historical facts, but our own relationship to time's passage. As I prepare to leave these midnight whispers behind, I carry with me the wisdom gathered in these hours between sunset and sunrise. The understanding that archives breathe even when no one listens, that materials remember beyond their textual content, that preservation involves not just protecting objects but maintaining their connections to living memory. The morning mist rises from document boxes like departing spirits, carrying these night lessons upward into dissolving memory, yet leaving their essence behind to guide whatever research questions the new day brings. Good night, time traveler. May your rest be as light as the footprints we leave in the sand of history.